Hello, global gardeners. Welcome to another fantastic Gardening Monday. I want to talk about soil today. So, over the course of the next 90 minutes, we'll be talking about soil, how to make good soil, the organisms in soil, all the components of soil, and even some compost making along the way. And of course, I'll be answering questions as you throw them at me. So nice to be here and see everyone checking on. It's just such a fantastic group we have. Trold is with us from Oslo, Norway, very late at night. So nice to have you here. And of course, all the regulars and Bowtie Life is joining us today. Jay is going to be here on her own today as a fantastic moderator. And of course, we're giving our best wishes to Heidi. So looking forward to hearing that everything goes well with you, Heidi, when you are back with us in a couple weeks. So what are we going to be talking about when I say that you can make good soil and all of these different components of soil? For regular viewers and those of you that have been watching for a while, one of the things I repeat on a pretty regular basis is that good soil is the key to gardening success. You can make a lot of mistakes along the way. You can try this, try that. Some work, some don't. But if it is the soil that you are focusing on as a primary component in your garden, the thing that you try to learn more about, the thing that you maybe experiment with, what you'll discover is the good soil really does make a difference. Now, you don't have to have good soil. You can have terrible soil. There are a lot of methods of gardening that don't have any soil at all. Hydroponic growing, for instance, is done in completely soilless mixtures. All the nutrients that the plants get in hydroponics comes through the water and whatever you choose to add to the water, all the macro and micronutrients that the plants are going to need. The Minnendorf method of gardening that is done outside actually uses like clay balls, and it's the same basic idea as an indoor hydroponic setup. You just use clay balls and you put your plants in the clay and then run the water that's loaded with the nutrients through that clay. You can definitely do that. The plants need nutrients. And as long as you provide the nutrients, they're going to grow. The problem that I have, having tried the hydroponic growing in the past, is that getting the nutrients right, getting the proper amounts in the amounts that the plants need those nutrients can be challenging. And I also think it adds a cost to gardening that many of us really don't want to pay. I am not doing hydroponic gardening like I was a couple years ago because buying all of those fertilizers, all of those nutrients, it starts digging into the budget. Instead, I focus on soil. I put most of my effort into growing outdoors, even though it's during a very short period of the time of the year. Here in Colorado, my short season only allows me about 3 months of really good growing. That's enough for me. So all of the other months, and even those primary growing months, I'm focused on the soil, because if your soil is good, the nutrients are there. And so when the plants need a nutrient, they don't have to search. They don't need additional fertilizer. Everything the plants need are there in the soil. And so that's what the topic is today. That's what we're going to be talking about. And those are the issues that I hope you kind of take to heart. And when we talk about the building of soil, the creating a good soil, the making of a good soil. Okay, if you take one thing away from today when you're trying to build a good soil and make your own, it's organic matter. That's where the nutrients come from. Now, compost is the most common source of organic matter. So you see this on my channel, you see it on a number of other gardening channels. When someone is talking about improving your soil, invariably they're going to say add compost to your soil. Compost is made up of organic matter. And when we talk about organic matter, we're talking about something that used to be alive, a tree, a plant, an insect, something that had life to it and then has died and is now residing in the soil as basically a plant corpse or an insect corpse. That's where the nutrients are. And other microbes that are in the soil will now feed upon the dead matter, feed upon those dead organisms, and release the nutrients that are held within that organic matter. So there's a number of steps involved, and I'll probably say this a few times as we discuss it today. There is a time factor. So in your garden, if you have terrible soil and your plants are doing terribly, you can put a liquid fertilizer that has the nutrients the plants need. And those usually petrochemical fertilizers are immediately available for the plants. So the plants suck up that nitrogen, for example, and start turning green and start growing great. When we're not looking at a chemical reaction, when we're looking at the soil, it takes time for all that organic matter to be broken down and for those nutrients to be released. Fall, I think, is an ideal time to start getting your soil ready for the plants you're going to grow next spring and next summer. Spring is, I think, the second best time to be amending your plants. So for those of you that are entering your spring right now, if you didn't amend your beds in fall, spring is a good time to go ahead and do that. Because of the time factor, we really need to anticipate a delay from when we put the organic matter into the soil until it's available for the plants. This is where compost comes back into the picture. Compost is usually mostly decomposed. There might still be some raw material, but for the most part, compost is decomposed organic material. So when you add compost to your garden bed, those nutrients are much more available on a faster basis for the plants. If you're using a chunky compost or any other type of organic matter, and so in fall, I will put grass clippings, crushed leaves, rough compost, straw. I'll put all of that into my soil, knowing that it's going to take months for that material to break down. But that's okay because I have months. I have fall and winter and spring for all that material to be broken down by the soil organisms. And by the time I put my plants in the ground in May, June, July for my summer garden, the material is decomposed. So what you're putting into your soil does make a difference as to when you can grow your plants. The rough material, give it as much time as possible. Fully decomposed compost, sure, you can add that to your beds in spring and it'll be ready. I still like to give it time because the organisms need to incorporate all of that material, but about a month. I like to have at least a month after applying compost before I'm putting anything into the beds. So some basic guidelines, kind of keep some of those thoughts in mind as we proceed. And let's see if you have any questions. Concrete Jungle says, I don't buy too many amendments, but I've had success adding chicken and farmyard manure to renew old compost. Great, great topic, manure. And so manure is organic material. It comes from living creatures. And when we talk about the manures that we use in our garden, we really want to be focused on plant-eating animals. So they're taking organic matter and then putting it through their gut, and their gut breaks it down even further. So when we add manures to our garden, the manure is partially decomposed. It's been broken down by the stomachs of these animals. So when you talk about chicken and farmyard manure, absolutely, those are the kind of things we want to be adding to a compost pile. Is usually the recommended way to use those. You can add manures to your soil, but the issue we have, like when we're talking about chicken manure, for instance, you have the possibility of E. coli and all kinds of other diseases and pathogens that could be present in chicken manure. So when you're adding manures directly to the soil, it should be an aged manure, whatever type it is. If it's a cow manure, steer manure, alpaca manure, chicken manure, rabbit manure, all those can be added, but generally we want them to be aged so that the sun and the rain can help dissipate any of those potential pathogens. Or put them into your compost pile as a good nitrogen source, and that will help break down the organic matter within your compost and really help lessen the possibility of those manures containing anything that might be harmful in a vegetable garden. Now, I apply manures, particularly alpaca manure, directly to some of my fruit beds. So, for instance, my raspberries will get a coating of alpaca manure because even if, and it's very, very low possibility for manures like alpaca versus manures like chicken manure, there's going to be no contact between the raspberries that I harvest at the top of the plant and the alpaca manure that might be at the bottom of my raspberry plant. When you're adding fresher manures to your vegetable garden, now you're increasing the likelihood that some of what you are harvesting might be contaminated. So if you have the option, I suggest putting the manures to your compost pile, like Concrete Jungle says. It really can renew old compost because of that nitrogen component that it's adding to the compost pile. And so finding a source of manure is one of those things that I think is really the most difficult aspect. And so when we're looking at what we want to use as a soil amendment, something that we want to use to make good soil, and we're looking at that organic matter, I sometimes have had to resort to buying a manure compost at a big box store. They sell them, and that's definitely an option. Luckily, now I live outside of town and I've got some more resources and I can get some other manures that are available. That's where my alpaca manure comes from. Look for those kind of sources. If you live in the city, if you live in the suburbs and you don't have a real good source for those kind of things, you might be surprised. You can look on Facebook Marketplace or a number of the other options out there for free materials or things that you can buy, and you might be able to just drive a little bit to a farm that is giving away some of those manures that you can now bring back and revitalize and add to a compost pile. Buying bags, certainly an option. But when you can use your own material, I think not only are you saving money, but you really know what is in your compost. The manures that you might have access to, and I've shoveled many a stall in a barn in my life. If you know the person you're getting manure from, and especially if you're shoveling the stall yourself, you get a good feel, literally, for how good that manure is. A big question to ask is about antibiotics, about what the animals have been fed, if they're using salt licks. I've mentioned this a couple times in the past years. When I was at the Galileo Garden, one of my buddies has a pretty big ranch operation in Kansas, next door here to Colorado. And he grows or raises his own cattle and has a business where he sells the meat. Well, with a big operation and a lot of cattle, there's a lot of manure. And so he donated a truckload, a dump truckload of manure for me to use in the beds and the compost at the Galileo Garden. And so the truck came in, he dumped all of this compost, and it was available for me to use. Now, it was a little bit early in the year. I'd already started growing plants, and so it really wasn't a good time to add the manure directly to the beds. I did add some of the manure to our compost piles. I didn't have that many compost piles. Had a lot of manure. So it was a big pile that sat for a few months, and it was exposed to all the rain that fell during those few months. Well, just so happens another garden buddy of mine who is also a big advocate of good soil, what had used some of that some of that manure in his garden, and the plants did not do well. So he tested the manure and found that it was very high in salt, because at the ranch they had salt licks and the cattle would lick the salt. Well, that's great for the cattle. It's not great for the plants. And sure enough, after my buddy showed me the test results when he'd had it analyzed in a laboratory, at the bottom of this pile, as we began to scrape it away, there was a layer of salt. All the salt in the manure had leached through the pile in all the rains that we had. And there was a layer of almost about 3 inches of packed salt at the bottom of that huge manure pile. Now, chances are you're not going to be using that much manure. And so you're not going to have that visual representation of how much salt can actually be in a big pile. But even in small amounts that you might add to your compost or to your garden beds, there can be enough salt that it's going to basically poison your soil and poison your plants along the way. So manures can be great. Just make sure you have a good source for it and know what the manure is coming from. Masabi Gal says, I put too much woody shavings in 2 of my beds when I started them. What can I do now to get that resolved and promote good growth next spring? And so when we put chunky material into our beds, be it woody materials or complete banana peels or orange slices or any of those other things that you might see people recommend that you can bury in the soil, like as trench composting, it's going to take nitrogen to break down those materials. And that nitrogen is going to come from the soil. Now, when that organic matter is decomposed and the microbes begin and finish that process, the nitrogen within all that rough material will be released into the soil. So it does tend to balance itself in time, but at least in the beginning, there's going to be a nitrogen deficiency in most cases because the microbes that are breaking down the materials need nitrogen. Woody materials tend to be broken down primarily by fungi, but there's also a component of bacterial breakdown as well. And so in our vegetable gardens as well, or as example, when we're growing over the course of just a few months in the summer, a nitrogen imbalance really can create a problem. So having too many woody shavings that are going to cause an imbalance is something we should try to avoid. But when you see it and recognize it, that's a great step. There's a few things you can do. Recognizing that the biggest issue is a nitrogen deficiency, you can add a nitrogen fertilizer to help bring back the nitrogen levels for plants, but also to help boost that microbial action within the soil. Just like we were talking a few minutes ago about the compost and the manures and how the fresh manures will add nitrogen to a compost pile to help revitalize it and get it cooking again. Well, the same thing happens in the soil. If you can give your soil a boost of nitrogen, that can help break down some of that rough material that might be in your soil. With time, it's not as big an issue. And it depends on how big the shavings are, how big the chunks are. I have had to dig out beds and put them through a sieve and basically strain out the big chunks before in beds that were amended with wood chips I like to use a lot of wood chips. Shavings fall into the same category. And I'll use those on my perennial beds. But if I decide to change the purpose of the bed and move from a perennial bed to like an annual vegetable garden bed, well, all those shavings and wood chips do cause some issues. And so what I've done before is get my wheelbarrow. I already have a sieve that I've created using hardware cloth to basically sift out the big chunks. And that's one option that you might have to take, where you basically sift your soil to get all those big pieces, those woody shavings out of your bed, so that what you're left with is the good soil and the good organic matter without all those big chunks. So that's an option and as well. So extra fertilizer, nitrogen in particular, and also getting rid of some of those chunks are really the two things that would be probably highest on my list as far as recommending. Big Wheel Dog is saying, tip of the day, bioassay every input prior to introduction to your garden system. Exactly. You got to know the source. And so I'm a huge advocate of making your own compost. And I don't think it was on this show. I think it was on a live stream I was on recently where we were talking about compost. And pretty much every garden I've had for the last 20 years, the very first thing I did in my garden was to set up a compost bin. Even before the beds were built, before I was growing anything, I had a compost system already going, so that as I cleaned up the space to build the garden, I could put all of the clippings and cuttings and prunings into the compost pile. If you make your own compost pile, especially if it's a priority and something that you'd start with, there's always going to be material. Now, you might need to get some of that material from others. So I have had to get some grass clippings from others because I don't have a lawn with my own grass clippings. And I've had to get crushed leaves from others as well because I don't have big trees yet to get all those leaves. In both those cases, with the grass and the leaves, I made sure to ask the question. Were they treated in any way? Were they sprayed with herbicides? Was there some residue that might be on that material that could harm my plants? And if there was, then I didn't take it. If it's clean, then yes, now it's bagged and it's ready to be used in my garden. So great tip. Absolutely. Find out what is on the material before you use it. And the best way to do that is just to use your own material at every possibility, because you know exactly what is going into your compost pile and ultimately what's going into your soil as well. The actual components, this is one of those things I know that some people have a minor misunderstanding when we talk about using organic material in the garden. So when you build your compost pile and harvest your compost for use, it doesn't mean that the material you put into it was certified organic material. You don't have to buy just organic produce from your store to then use in your compost pile. Two different things. Certified organic is purely something that is a certification that growers will use to talk about the method of how they grow. Organic material, as I've been talking about, is everything. It could be a certified organic apple peel from an organic apple you bought at the store, or it can just be an apple that fell from your own apple tree. Both of those are organic materials when we talk about putting organics into our soil. 54 Cal is asking, good morning. Hello to you as well. Should I not till in stalks from peppers and tomatoes? I heard pests overwinter under large debris, been overrun with potato beetles. So when we talk about the different pests, and so this is a good question, because yes, some pests will overwinter in different parts of the plant. So some pests will actually burrow into the plant for plants that will be dormant over the course of the winter. So I've mentioned the raspberry cane borer that I have here in my part of Colorado. And so the raspberry cane borer adult will lay eggs into the canes. If the canes are above ground over the course of the winter, then the larva develops. It eats its way out the next year and ends up killing the cane. So there are many pests like that will actually overwinter inside the plant. Some will dig down to the roots and will overwinter in the ground. Generally, you don't have both. So if you have an insect that is residing above ground in debris, in stems, and then you bury those stems, often that's enough to actually kill that pest, because as that stem in the ground decomposes, now all the microbes are going to feed on the larva from that particular pest. And so when we talked about last week, I was talking a little bit more about some of the activities that we do in our garden in fall in particular. And one of those things is cleaning up the debris. So if you have a pest that you know resides in the plant debris, like the stems and the leaves of your plants, go ahead and clean up and throw those into the compost and mix them into your compost pile in fall. And that'll help do away with the pests so that they don't emerge the next year. If the pest you have is a burrowing pest where the larva will actually be in the ground, then be careful about the material that you're putting into the ground. This is one of those springtime activities. So if you have a pest that is in the ground in larval form in springtime, great reason to add compost to your bed and actually turn it into the soil, because by disrupting the soil, you're actually bringing that larva from a nice protected location. You've all seen these grubs. That's what grubs are. They're the larval form of beetles. And so the larva that is in the soil underground, overwintering, if you can disrupt that soil so that you expose those grubs to the birds, or for you, I like to pick up the grubs when I'm doing this in spring and throw them over the fence to my neighbor's chickens. That's one option. And so you can kind of do a combination. You can go ahead and incorporate pepper and tomato stalks. I I put the stalks and the bigger plants like peppers and tomatoes into my compost pile, and then let that bacteria break everything down to include killing anything that might reside in those stems, rather than bury the stems. So I'm not directly burying any of those stalks into the ground, but you can. I mean, farmers for centuries have done exactly that, where they till in the leaves and the stalks into the soil, and that helps replenish the soil for the next year's growth. The key is just recognizing what the pest is and whether that pest is a soil-borne pest or whether it's a plant-based pest. And if it's plant-based pest, then by all means you can till it into the soil, and it usually will, with time, break down. That's the main reason I'm not putting my pepper and tomato plants into my soil, is because they're bigger, they're thicker, they take more time to break down. They'll break down faster in my compost pile than they will in the soil. And so you could till those into the soil in most cases, but I think it's actually quicker, and the result is compost that you can now amend in springtime if you want to do that. Bowtie Life is saying, I use horse bedding compost, but it's been sitting for years in our high rainy climate. I have not tested for salt, but there can't be that much, I'm sure, hoping. So yes, so the key is that rains will leach out the salt. And so if you've got it in your compost pile and it's leaching down to the bottom of your pile and maybe even into the soil underneath. So chances are your compost doesn't have any salt, especially If in a really rainy climate, I wouldn't be too worried about the salt. But yeah, go ahead and check it at the base and see if maybe you might see some of the salt residue. I wouldn't be that concerned. It's more of an issue in like just a general compost pile that is moist and it isn't being leached by heavy rains. That's more of the concern when I talk about being aware of the salt potential, and that way you have more likelihood of having a safe compost. And Petrus is saying in the UK and Australia, chicken manure pellets. Yeah, so I've heard of chicken manure pellets. I don't think I've seen chicken manure pellets in any of the nurseries or stores that I shop in. But the concept is good. So there are a number of pellets that you could use as a soil amendment because uh, of the material that is within that pellet. So, for instance, alfalfa pellets are sold as a food for rabbits. Alfalfa is a great amendment for soil. It's high in nitrogen, it's a great organic material. And so you could use the alfalfa pellets in your soil. And that falls into along the same lines as using a chicken manure pellet. Chicken manure has the organic matter, it has the nitrogen. You certainly could add that as a soil amendment to help make a good soil, or add it to your compost as a boost of fertilizer, both options. So I don't know how much the chicken manure costs, but if you don't have a source for chicken manure, uh, I'm assuming that the processing of a pellet would take out any of those potential pathogen concerns and could be a good source. So I'll have to look into that more. It's not something that I've done, but yeah, I think potentially it is one of those things that could be beneficial. And Jay's raising a good point as always. We promote various small gardening channels. Please give them some love. They really appreciate the support. So lots of regular viewers here, and I know many of you have channels, and I am in full support of you. And for all of you who aren't aware of the ones that have a channel, go ahead and mention. Like Bowtie Life in the Garden, for instance, has got some really good videos. He shows some really good things that he does in the garden. Small channel, great opportunity to learn some things and see how someone else is doing it. So, all the rest of you, if you've got a small channel, we do definitely promote it, and I appreciate you, Jay, for helping promote it. And you can just mention in the comments if you've got a channel that has gardening videos that maybe some of us would be interested in viewing, and also giving some of the support that we can to those of you that have it. And Yankee Sister Homestead, of course, is one of my favorite people. So always nice to see you here, and thank you for that, Jay, as well. Okay, let's see. Gina says, if I can't get a firm answer out of a compost ingredient producer, I sprout some beans in that soil with that ingredient added. Great, cheap assay method. Yeah, great idea. I did a video, I think it's a couple years ago now, where I was talking about straw in particular that could be contaminated by herbicide residue, the aminopyrrolid family of herbicides in particular. And that was something I suggested in that video as well. If you're using straw and you're not sure if it's been contaminated, if you're using manure and in your compost and you're not sure if your compost might be contaminated, go ahead and use the material either as a compost or as a mulch, a compost in the soil as an amendment, or as a mulch, and grow a fast growing plant, something that you can see within a day or two if they're affected, like beans or lettuce. Great things that you can just put in the ground. They're going to sprout pretty quickly, grow pretty quickly. And if you see that the plant is is disfigured, if it's growing in really weird shapes, if it's got really crinkled leaves, or if it just grows a couple inches and then dies, then yeah, it could be a contamination issue. And so, great tip. It's a cheap way of testing with just a few plants before you contaminate your entire garden. And it's a nice habit to get into when you don't know your source. You know, most of us are relatively lazy. We get into patterns, and we might test compost or a manure, and the first couple times we use it, everything's okay. And then we get a bit lackadaisical and we don't test it again as we continue sourcing from somebody else. It is a good idea to try to do some of those things on a regular basis. And then that brings us up to soil testing, which I think really is one of those things that not enough of us do, and I highly recommend. Now, 20 years ago, I went through the Master Gardener program. I learned all about soil testing. I learned a lot about soil, and I recognized that having that baseline, knowing what your soil is, can really help you out as you build new soil. As you make a good soil, it helps to know how good it was to start with. So, at this house, for instance, one of the very first things I did was test my soil. I made videos about testing my soil before I made videos about building beds and growing a garden. And I found out, to no surprise, my soil is terrible. I know I need to add organic matter to my soil to get the nutrient levels up. After 4 years, I did another soil test to see how good my soil was. And I actually found out that I had an abundance of nutrients in my beds from just a few years of adding organic matter. That is the recommended way. That's what I suggest that you do, but you don't have to. For 15 years plus, I gardened without doing a soil test. I knew I had bad soil because of my fellow gardeners who told me how bad their soil was. And so I just added organic matter and I just kept making my soil better by adding more organic matter. And then my plants ended up doing great without ever doing a soil test. I didn't know the ratios of the macronutrients. I didn't know if I had deficiencies or abundance of any particular nutrient. I just knew my plants were doing well. You can take that approach. You can just keep adding organic matter, tending to your plants, and you should see results in just a few years, even if you start with a bad soil. Or do a soil test so you know exactly what you have. And that can be beneficial if you need to add a particular nutrient that you might be deficient in. Most of our soils have sufficient magnesium and sulfur and calcium, the other three macronutrients. Good portion of our soils have enough phosphorus. They might have okay levels of potassium. It's usually the nitrogen that our soils are most deficient in. And that's because nitrogen will leach out of the soil. The nitrites and the nitrates and the ammonium, those different forms of nitrogen that are in the soil, will leach out, particularly in areas that get a lot of rain. So that's really where the soil test comes in. It's just getting a baseline of what you have. And I actually have a link in the description below to RX Soil, which is a home-based soil kit. And you can go online, you can order a kit, they'll send you the box. You just go ahead and take the soil sample and send it back to them. And usually, I think the last time I did it, it was within a week. I was able to go online and see the results of my soil test and really get a good idea of how far along I have come. The first soil test I did through Colorado State University, that's when I established my baseline. And then from then on, I've been using the RX soil kit just to see if my beds are okay or not. Because it does reach a point where you can have too many nutrients. you can have an abundance in some of those macronutrients in particular. And that tends to kind of crowd out some of the other nutrients. And so magnesium, if you get too much magnesium, for instance, it can affect the uptake of some of the other nutrients that the plants need. So getting periodic soil testing, more to see if you have too much of a nutrient, can really actually not only help your plants in the long run, but it shows that you don't need to add more amendments, at least for another year, maybe two. So I've got one of my beds that I showed in a video where I did this, and that's exactly what I did. I tested, I saw that everything was high, to include the organic matter was at 5%, which was my target. So I didn't amend this last year in that bed. It was okay. And I have been growing squash in that bed. Squash is a heavy feeder, it takes a lot of nutrients. My zucchini, I've had bigger zucchini growing faster than ever before. And the squash it's a Tahitian melon squash, huge. The plants are beautiful. And that's growing in a bed that I did not amend last year, because a soil test had shown me that the soil was adequate to grow plants. Now, I'll probably amend at the end of this year. Basically, I gave it a year off, but probably the right answer is I should do another soil test to determine whether I need to amend or not, rather than just assume that the squash, the zucchini has sucked out the nutrients and I need to add more. The bed still might be good for another year without having to amend it any further. So regular amending to build a soil takes a few years. But once you reach that level, you can kind of coast a little bit. And that kind of brings us into the no-till gardening arena, because just adding a few inches of compost on top of the soil, like Charles Dowding has shown in his videos and books, once your soil is good, to sustain the soil, you may not need to work that hard. All those soil organisms are already there. And so by adding more food as a compost or as a organic mulch on top of the soil, the organisms, the arthropods, the earthworms, they're going to help by taking that soil on top of the surface, or taking that material on top of the soil surface and then bringing it down into the soil. And after a while, you can have a very successful garden using no-dig methods by letting nature incorporate the material that you're adding on top of the soil. But it does take a while to get to that point. And most of my garden area isn't there yet. My raised beds that I'm putting all that focus into and amending regularly, they are doing great. The open areas, it's still a work in progress. But I have mulch. I've got thick layers of wood chip mulch around my fruit trees, around my fruit bushes, around my perennial plants. This year I was putting in some new plants, some new flowers in my perennial garden area. And as I pulled aside that mulch, every time I dug into the soil to transplant, I found earthworms. Now, 5 years ago, there were no earthworms that I could find. It didn't matter how much I dug, there was no earthworms because there was no organic matter in my soil. By just placing thick mulch on top of the soil, that has exploded the earthworm population underneath that mulch and made the soil better along the way. So just use organic matter in the soil and on top of the soil, and it really does make a huge difference. Hi, Jay, asking, can I compost apples that are likely to have pest infestation, i.e. visible signs of infestation and no sprays? Absolutely. And so many of if I'll say most of the pests that are affecting apples are not in the soil. They might be in the fruit. And so that's one reason why you should clean up the dropped fruit around an apple tree, because you don't want a pest to overwinter in that fruit. By burying that fruit or by putting it into the compost pile, you're essentially killing that pest, because that pest needs exposure to the outside, needs to be able to crawl out of the apple into the air. It's not going to be able to climb out of the apple and survive in the soil. And so it depends on the pest, of course, as to what the best recourse is. But I'm not aware of a pest that is in an apple that will also all overwinter in the ground. And so by composting those apples, the microbes are going to kill any pests, and you should have very few issues as far as eggs they might have laid that are going to be now in the soil. I'm just not aware of any. And if someone knows of one, by all means, educate us. But if you have a hot compost pile, even those eggs are going to be totally destroyed in a hot compost pile. So, yeah, and this holds true. That this is one reason why I compost my tomatoes and my peppers. I don't have diseases I'm concerned with. There's the possibility that there might be pests in those stems, but when I put them into my compost pile, I'm killing whatever pests might be on the stems. So that can be a really great way to get rid of pests and break their life cycle, is by composting them so that they're not in your plants anymore. MedTech 131, what do you do with spent flower heads that are full of seeds if you don't need them? I have beautiful celosia that reseeds easily. Where do you discard that type? Another thing for the compost pile, a hot compost pile. And by hot, we're talking over 140 degrees Fahrenheit, 60 degrees Celsius for a sustained period of time. And you can even get hotter than that, up to 160 degrees and 71 Celsius. That will be enough to kill the seeds. And generally, we talk about it as being killing the weed seeds. But when you clean up your beds, if there are still the seed heads at the end of the season, like in fall, you're cleaning up your bed, you're cutting down the plants, and there's some seed heads, go ahead and throw them in the compost pile, and that'll take care of most of them. Worst case, you might have some seeds that survive in the compost. Now you use that compost as a soil amendment or as a mulch. Maybe you have some celosia start to grow. If you're not caring for it, if it's in full sun and not getting a lot of water, the plant's not going to survive. But take a good look anytime that you're using a compost in your beds, and what should be sprouting and what doesn't sprout. And if something sprouts that isn't supposed to be there, then just pluck it. That's easy weeding, is to pull out plants that might survive, then just drop them on top of the soil as a addition to your mulch, and it's good. The other option that I practice, I drop a lot of my seed heads just all over the ground, let them sprout. If it's in a place that I don't want, I treat it as a weed and I pull it. But especially this time of year at my garden club, I save the seeds, and so does everybody else. And so when we get together for our garden club meetings, there are always bags and envelopes of seeds that we share back and forth. So if you've got some gardener friends, or you're thinking about joining a garden club, save some of those seeds to swap with other gardeners. If you don't want to swap and you don't want to use your compost, then sure, go ahead and throw them away. You might never know. You might have a landfill that suddenly has a lot of plants growing because you put seeds in your trash. So I wouldn't be too concerned if I were you as to what happens to those seeds. But if you really don't want them, first, I would say give them away. And second would be to just go ahead and throw them away if you don't want to put them to your compost pile, or if you don't have a compost pile. George is saying, I started a leaf mold pile this week. Cool. I've been so stingy with my leaf mold. I need to start a leaf mold pile this year, probably. I did a couple of videos a couple of years ago showing my leaf mold. I love it. And so I harvested it and I put it into a 55-gallon trash can, and it's continued to break down, and it's so fine and so soft and so wonderful that it's like I'm trying to only use it in potting mixes as a peat moss or as a coco coir alternative. It's just wonderful, wonderful stuff. takes a long time to do. You can see that in my videos, but it's wonderful stuff. So good for you. Fall is a great time to start a leaf mold pile, and a big pile with a lot of leaves can actually generate a lot of leaf mold. And you can put that directly into your soil as an organic amendment. Great stuff. It's fungal as opposed to bacterial primarily. And our soil should have a blend of fungi and bacteria. So I love leaf mold in the soil. It's just too bad it takes so long for it to to be usable, but great for you. And anyone that is wondering about what leaf mold is or how to make it, check out my videos because I talk a lot about it and I show the whole process. George is also asking, I have backyard chickens. My chicken manure is mixed with straw. Do I just compost that? Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so straw is a brown, it's a carbon component for compost piles. And the chicken manure is a green, a nitrogen component for compost piles. And you need to have a blend of the greens and the browns, the nitrogens and the carbon. And so chicken manure mixed with straw, when my neighbor cleans out his coop and gives me the bag that is the result of cleaning the coop, it's a mix of straw, sometimes wood chips, and chicken manure. I throw it all into my compost pile. Absolutely. And you may, as you get into making compost and the more you know about compost, you do need to have a pretty good balance of the nitrogen versus the carbon. So if you see that it's more of the chicken droppings than the straw, then you might need to add more browns like dried grass or newspaper or whatever you're using for your browns. If you're seeing that there's more straw than there is the chicken droppings, then you might want to add in some of the greens, the leaves that you're plucking from your garden beds. So you may need to, balance it with other materials, but as a blend, oh yeah, great blend that you can throw into your compost pile. And the material straw will break down pretty quickly in a compost pile, especially when it's mixed up with that nitrogen. Okay, there's Jay catching up with the video that I was talking about earlier about herbicide contamination. Thank you for that. Okay. Trying to catch up. I realize I'm about 20 minutes behind in my comments here. There's the video for the home soil testing. Thank you for that, Jay. Appreciate it. Okay, gonna keep scrolling down. Shout out to Yankee Sister who says she had to leave. That was about 15 minutes ago. So you're still listening. It's great that you're still here. There's the video from Jay on the soil testing. You are just so on top of things, Jay. I do appreciate it. Big Will Dog saying, I've learned that keeping my leaf mold in hot compost piles close to my garden beds seems beneficial for those, or it seems to benefit those beds from the leachate that comes off naturally. Yes, absolutely. I talk about that in my leaf mold video where I had my leaf mold pile in an area that I was planning to grow plants in for that specific reason, that as the material decomposes and as you water it or as it rains, you're going to have some of those nutrients leach down into the bottom, into the soil. And so if you're making leaf mold or if you're making compost, that's a great way to make good garden soil. And that is by changing the location from year to year. So have your compost pile in an area near your garden or in the garden, and then the next year move it to another spot. And the soil where that compost was should be really, really good soil. And the same with the leaf mold pile. The soil underneath is going to be great. So just keep swapping around where you're composting and making the leaf mold. Great, great idea. And if you've got the space to do that, I think it's a wonderful idea. And after you clean up the pile, you'll see that the soil underneath will be darker and look richer than any soil nearby. And it's because of the influence of everything that had been sitting on top of it for months. So take advantage of that, especially if you're building a new garden and you're planning to expand the garden with new beds next year. That's where you should build your piles this year, so that it kind of helps boost the soil, and you may not need to amend as much as you would originally have thought you did. Aaron's asking or saying, I do container gardening and added green sand per one of your videos, but I'm unclear how long it takes to break down. I know it takes a while, but not sure how long. So green sand is an inorganic material. So when we talk about, so in videos in the past, when I talk about organic methods, so now we get back to that method of gardening, using organic methods like an organic grower. And so I have some videos where I talk about using blood meal for a nitrogen source, and then using bone meal as a phosphorus source, and then using the green sand as a potassium source. Now, green sand is mined; it's a mineral, and so it's not going to break down. It's not going to decompose, but the minerals within it are going to help boost the potassium levels within your soil. It's like when you are adding lime to your soil to affect not only the pH, but to affect maybe the calcium levels of your soil. There are inorganic mineral components that we can add to our soil that aren't going to decompose at all. They don't break down. They're just adding a component there with the microbes that help boost some of those levels. So green sand is one of those kind of things that you kind of add once. It takes a long time for all the microbe life to build up and for some of that potassium to become available. But it's not like a yearly application that you need to add to your beds because it's breaking down and decomposing. It'll be in your soil for years and years and years, and helping to add some of uh, the potassium components. In containers, keep an eye on the plants, because anytime that I'm following the organic gardening methods by using the materials like blood meal, bone meal, and green sand, those take a while to have their nutrients available for the plants. And it's going to take a lot longer than those petrochemicals, those synthetic fertilizers that we're going to be putting into our beds. And so you may need to add a fast release fertilizer when you're using some of those organic methods. That's why I encourage building your soils, even container soil, weeks, months ahead of time, so that you have an opportunity to develop the microbes, to develop the soil life that is going to make those nutrients available. And it's happened to me, and occasionally I'll get a question about it. I'm using those organic materials and my plants just aren't doing well. Well, it could be that it just hasn't been long enough, because they are a slow release fertilizer, basically. And so anytime that you're using those kind of materials, it's going to take a while, and you may need to supplement with other fertilizers. And there's the link to the leaf mold video. Thank you for that, Jay. Mountains and Mayhem is saying, I have 2 half-gallon jars of marigold seeds. Do you know where I could give or sell some? I thought about selling some on Facebook Marketplace, but not sure if that's okay. I think it's okay. I don't know why it wouldn't be. You can sell anything on Facebook Marketplace. So yeah, absolutely give it a try. And see if you might have some buyers there. You might be able to, post a note at your local library to say you've got seeds available. That could definitely be an option. And then check with your neighbors, with schools, with garden clubs, and see if somebody wants some marigold seeds. So there are options there that and then you could practice guerrilla gardening. I have my video where I talk about the seed bombs, where I make little clay balls and put seeds in them. And so the idea of guerrilla gardening is that you just go to a vacant lot, especially in urban areas, and you just put seeds in the lot. And over time, those seeds will sprout. And what used to be an ugly vacant lot now has flowers growing in it. So that's always an option too. If you've got some areas near you that you want to pretty up a little bit, drop some of your marigold seeds. I wouldn't do that on private property, but it is an option to consider. Bowtie Life says, if you want a ton of large brown leaves year round, get an American sycamore tree. I have phenomenal browns all year long, and especially in the fall. It's huge. I love it. Yes, any big tree is a great option. We don't have the sycamores here in my part of Colorado, but that's awesome. And when we talk about the leaves in fall, I suggest raking up those leaves and using those leaves. And especially if you have a big tree with a lot of leaves, do a lot of leaves. Bag it up. I've got bags of leaves in my garage right now from a year ago because there's always use for leaves in the garden. I use them primarily as mulch, but when I want leaves, I've got leaves because I bag them and save them. I use a lot of them. And if you have a big tree with a lot of leaves, by all means, use that as a mulch throughout your garden area. Make a leaf mold pile. And if you still have bags left over, save the bags. So come springtime, you want to add some more mulch to your garden. You've got crushed leaves all ready to go. So I don't have big trees like that. I wish I did. I have to rely on others for doing those kind of things. But good for you. I'm glad you've got those to use. Wasabi Gal's asking, been using grass clippings for the chicken run bedding. I hope to use that as a mulch this fall. What do you think? Yeah, so the biggest issue is what I touched on earlier. Anytime you use the chicken manure, so even in the chicken run, there's going to be some chicken droppings. It can be a great mulch because you've got the clippings that are acting as a mulch, and then you've got the chicken manure that will break down, and the nitrogen in that manure is going to leach into the soil and actually help benefit the soil. So it can be good. Just be aware of some of those potential issues with the pathogens and like the E. coli that could be in those droppings. And so if you're using it in your garden area, I would be careful about using it around like the salad crops, the spinach and the lettuce that is going to be right there in contact with that mulch. Be careful about that. But for the peppers and the tomatoes that are elevated above the mulch, it's not as big a problem. And so I've used the straw mixed with chicken manure. I've used that as a mulch on my tomatoes before and never had an issue because the tomato plants were well above that. And by the time the plants got big enough to produce fruit, the chicken manure had either dried or had already broken down to the point that it wasn't even noticeable. But just be aware of those potential problems whenever you're using those materials in an edible garden. Myra's asking, so heat from composting kills bugs that may get in the pile. My husband says it will attract critters. So it depends on how hot your pile is. And so I do a lot of cool composting where I'm not building up to the high temperatures. And so when I add the fruits and the vegetables to my compost pile, then yeah, I occasionally see mice in my compost pile because it's not hot. And I have a couple dogs now that love to chase mice. And so it's not a big issue for me because I'll see a mouse, and probably shortly after I see it, one of the dogs will see it, and the mouse is no longer a problem. But yes, a cool compost pile can entice some vermin to come to that area and other potential pests. And a cool compost pile will not kill any seeds, and it will not destroy any pathogens. A hot compost pile, the one that gets to those really high temperatures that I was talking about earlier, then yes. I mean, imagine, do you want to be sitting around 160 degrees? Of course not. Neither will a mouse or any other pest. Any pest that's in the compost that gets that hot is going to be killed. We can't survive at 140 or 160 degrees. Neither can insects or any other pests that might be in the pile. So it depends. Depends on what kind of compost pile you have as to whether it's going to attract a critter or whether it's going to kill the bugs. And it's all about the heat, and it's all about the microbes breaking down the material in that pile. And if you take the effort to get a hot pile, and I'm not sure if Tony is still on, but Tony O'Neill from Simplified Gardening has got some great videos, and his books, his book on composting, fantastic, and it breaks down all the science about the compost and how it kills everything and what you need to do to maintain that heat. And it takes some effort, but it's beneficial if you're really looking to have those pests and diseases and seeds destroyed. You can do it in your compost. So Sean is saying, I haven't been able to make enough compost to amend my raised beds this fall, so I planted cover crops on several of them. Thank you for saying that, because that's on my list of things I wanted to talk about today. It's the cover crops. In nature, generally, except when we look at deserts, soil is going to be covered by plants. There is some type of plant growing on soil everywhere. We should do that in our garden. We should have our soil covered at all times. Now, I use a lot of mulch during the growing season, and I'll even use mulch going into the winter, depending on when I clean up my beds and if there's enough time for cover crops. So cover crops are great, and I've got videos on cover crops as well. The idea is that you have a plant growing on the surface or to cover the surface of the soil. It has amazing benefits and a long list of benefits that I talk about in those videos, from keeping the weed seeds down, but probably more importantly, improving the soil. And so the choice of cover crop is based on what you want to do with the soil. So for instance, I have really dense soil in a lot of my garden area. And so I've used daikon radishes as a cover crop. The daikon radish is a big root that helps break apart the soil. That's one way to help get better soil. If it's dense and compacted, is break it apart by using roots that will help you. You don't have to get in and dig it. You let the plants take care of it. There are a whole plethora of plants that add nitrogen to the soil. The legumes, you plant an Austrian pea, and it helps cover the soil, helps protect it over the winter, and it's adding nitrogen into the soil as well. So lots of different plants we can put into place to improve our soil. And Sean has it's basically a really good idea. When I talk about the fall and the spring amending of your soil, if you can amend your soil in fall, put cover crops in. Then in spring, most of those cover crops are suitable as a biomass, as plant material, as an organic material that you just turn that into the soil, and it helps enrich and improve the organic matter within the soil. Started as a plant in the fall, and in the spring, it's in the soil being fed upon by all those organisms. So cover crops, great option, and something you should be thinking about. If you don't have cover crops, then use a mulch over the winter. Having bare soil, first off, the sun is going to bake it, and the UV rays can kill the soil life in those top few inches. The rains or the snows are going to compact that soil. If you have plants in it, or if you have mulch on it, the likelihood of being compacted is much less. If it's on a slope, if it's in open ground and you have rains and you're worried about erosion, well, the cover crops can actually reduce the possibility of erosion. And then by just being covered, any weed seeds that are blowing in over the course of the winter or early spring have nowhere to land. And so you're going to have much less of a weed problem if you use cover crops. So A lot of benefits to cover crops, absolutely. So let's go ahead and talk about the background real quickly. This comes from Andre, and uh, Andre normally has had a bigger garden, but this is where he's gardening right now in this little alcove in the corners of this building. And of course, you probably noticed down in the corner is his garden dog Horatio. And so I appreciate this, Andre, that you sent this to me. This is one of those things. I often show pictures that you have sent me that are expansive gardens, or the backyard or the front yard garden, and they tend to have multiple beds over the course of whatever the space happens to be. I think this is a really good example that if you don't have a big backyard to put a whole bunch of beds in, that doesn't mean you can't have a garden. If you've got any space that you can put plants into, you can have a garden. And so look how beautiful this is. In fact, I noticed just over my shoulder here, it looks like an artichoke that's growing. So we've got flowers, we've got the fruiting vegetable garden plants, tomato plants, artichoke plants, all in a relatively small space, just tucked into the corner of the house. What a fantastic idea. And as long as you're choosing the right plants based on how much sunlight the area gets, you can have a very successful garden. If you look at the ground, you can actually see how dark it looks, and you can see the mulch that's on the ground as well. So amending the soil, building up a good soil, mulching it, matching the plants to the area, to the location, you can grow pretty much anywhere. You may need a raised bed on top of contaminated soil or soil with a lot of roots in it, but you can still garden just about anywhere you've got space. And of course, bring your garden buddy out to help you garden. So you can see the shade and the sun line. So I'm guessing that this picture is taken probably right before the sun is moving in, or maybe as the sun is moving out. I don't think he told me whether this was east facing or west facing, but I love this. And I've mentioned before, when we're designing our gardens, that we design our gardens not only to look at from outside when we're standing outside looking at the garden, or standing in the garden, but also to look at from inside the house. So now imagine you're inside the house looking out these windows, and you're seeing the big beautiful plants, and you're seeing the big beautiful blooms. That's so wonderful. I've had different houses, and even this one, I'll walk by a window and I'll just stop at the window and look outside, because I like the view of what I put outside the window. Think about that as you're putting a garden in. Often our gardens are far away from the house. Put them near the house. And the other general practice is that the plants near the house are flowers. It's like they have to be perennials, or they have to be bushes. Not at all. Go ahead and put in a vegetable garden right next to your house. If that's the space you have, use that space. So a lot of nice things to see here. I really do appreciate that you shared this, and I actually got some ideas as well. I really love how you've blended the plants growing side by side, helping to support each other, and obviously they have similar water needs and sun needs, and everything looks great. So absolutely fantastic option. If you think you don't have enough space, you probably do. You may just have to shift how you're gardening and decide to try something a little bit new. So Eli and Kate are joining us today. Guerrilla gardening, also known as monkeying around in the garden. I like that. That's good. Uh, you can monkey around with your guerrilla gardening all you want and enjoy the entire process. Absolutely. Okay, I'm catching up. I'm only about 10 minutes behind. There's a good one that you should look at. What you need to know about composting with Tony O'Neill. So always good information from Tony when it comes to composting. And there's the Composting Masterclass, Feed Your Soil, Not Your Plants. That's the book uh, for Tony. Now, I will say, I'll put a plug in for myself as well. So Tony's book is available on Amazon. In my link below, I actually have a link to my Amazon affiliate. And so if you don't have Tony's book, I suggest get Tony's book. Use my link in the description because that will send you to Amazon. It won't send you to a special page. It'll just send you to Amazon. But then you can buy Tony's book and I'll get a very small percentage because you bought it through my Amazon link. And Tony, of course, will benefit because you bought his book. So this is one of those ways that you can benefit both of us if you're looking to get Tony's book, is to actually link through through my Amazon link. And that holds true for anything you're going to get on Amazon. I mentioned recently about supporting channels, and that's a great way. A lot of us who have channels will have an Amazon link. And if you click on our link, it sends you to the same Amazon site that you would normally shop on. But then everything you buy, we actually benefit a little bit from that. It doesn't cost anything extra. It's going to be the exact same cost, whether you use our link or not. But by using our link, it really does help support our channels and help us do more. And Tony and I were actually on the Grow Up live stream over the weekend, or I guess actually it was on Thursday. And this is one of the topics. There were 4 of us, all creators, and talking about this. It makes a difference. You know, we spend a lot of time making these videos. We spend a lot of time getting this information out. And even the few pennies, the few dollars that come in from something like Amazon, it really does help us as we have to buy new equipment. You know, many of you probably know less than a year ago, I had to buy a whole new computer for doing these live streams because my other computer died. Well, it's those kind of things like the Amazon link that really enable us to keep doing. So you don't have to, but it's just one of those options if you want to really support our channels. And that holds true for everybody, but particularly Tony and me. And I know Eli and Kate have a Patreon to help support their channel as well. And so, you know, none of us like asking for money. I certainly don't. That's why you don't hear me do it very often. But it does make a difference as to what we can offer and what we can provide when it comes to the information that we are producing for you on YouTube. So I'll leave it at that. Okay. Let's see. I think I'm almost, yeah, there you go, Llama Llama. I'd love to look out my window to see that. You know, when we build our gardens, think about doing it for yourself. Think about giving yourself something pretty to look at. And I think there's just so much that we worry about and we work at, and it becomes a chore, and then we forget to enjoy it. Well, it's sitting in your chair or at the dinner table at the end of the day after you're exhausted from working in the garden all day long. And you're not thinking about what fun it was, especially if your muscles are sore. But if you can get up from the kitchen table and walk down the hall and look outside and say, oh, wow, it's worth it. Everything I did looks wonderful. I love that. I absolutely love it. I've got some projects going on right now, and I'll just stand back and say, wow, that looks really good. And then I'll go in and I'll tend to my sore muscles. But give yourself something to look at. Absolutely. Dusty Flats is saying, word of caution about planting next to old houses, lead paint. Not sure how long it would stay active. I don't know about that as either. Lead paint has not been used for decades, but I don't know about the contamination levels. This is another reason to get a soil test. You can get a soil test, and it can tell you lead levels in your soil next to the house. But that's an interesting concern. That's something I don't have a lot of information about. But yeah, I would suggest if it's an old house with old paint, Soil test is even a better idea. John C. saying, my tomatoes are right outside my patio doors in containers. I can see them from the dining table, and one of the flower beds is visible from the kitchen window. There you go. That's the whole idea. Pork Chop is saying, my neighbor's pine tree needles drop around my tomato plants. Would this be bad to leave them there? No, not at all. I use the pine needles as a mulch throughout my garden. In my vegetable garden, I actually have them mixed with wood chips in the pathways because my neighbor's tree drops a lot of pine needles and they give me their pine needles and I've got too many to use. So I use them on my pathways as a mulch. But I've got pine needles around all of my strawberry plants. I have pine needles mixed in with the wood chips around my raspberry plants. I've got pine needles that I use in some of my perennial garden beds. The only issue that I would be concerned about is just what you're going to do when the tomato plants are done. So, we talked earlier about the wood shavings that get mixed into the soil and the potential for a nitrogen deficiency. Pine needles break down very, very slowly. And so if you mix them into the soil, it could cause that kind of issue next year. Contrary to what a lot of people believe, dried pine needles are not going to change the pH of your soil. They are not acidic. And so they're not going to affect the soil from that perspective. As a mulch, they interlock, they don't blow away. In my windy region, that's a big concern about things blowing away. Pine needles stay in place. That's wonderful. But at the end of the season, if you're going to amend the soil, I would rake the pine needles to the side, then amend the soil, then put the pine needles back as a mulch going into the winter or to set yourself up for spring planting. So no, not bad at all. It's just another source of organic material that you can use in the garden, and it works great. You can add pine needles to your compost pile, and this is where you can see the differences in decomposition. So if you're using kitchen waste and the vegetable garden trimmings in your compost pile, and then you throw the pine needles in as a brown component, you're going to see at the end, after everything is decomposed, that you'll still be able to see the pine needles. And so you may need to sift out your compost because you've got all the pine needles that are still left behind. It takes a while for them to break down, but can be a great mulch. Absolutely can be a great mulch. Big Will Dog says, I bought Tony's book and it's helped me prioritize my composting this year. Got twice as much as last year made. Cool. Yeah, it's a great resource. It really is. And if you want to do composting, by all means, YouTube's got a lot of videos. But if you want the science behind it, if you want the math formulas, if you want the real in-depth information, and even the basic information, Tony's book is a fantastic resource that gardeners can benefit from. Okay, Eli and Kate says, we're just out doing that, walking around, deadheading and admiring the dahlias. Good for the mood. Yeah, I was doing that yesterday with my cosmos. Most of my flowers have faded, but the cosmos are still great. But something I did this year, I show it on my Instagram, or I did show it earlier in the year. Flowers in a green stock. I've got my green stock right outside my kitchen door, and right now I've got some basil growing, and most of the salad crops are going to seed. But I got one of my towers that I put flowers in: petunias, pansies. I had some snapdragons, and it's still flowering. By choosing those kind of annuals that just continue to flower, I love it. And so I can walk by my window, my kitchen window, my dining room window, my door, and I see that tower of flowers. And every day when I walk out to take care of the garden, the first thing I see is that tower of flowers. I love it. Absolutely love it. And so you'll probably see more from me next year on growing pansies and petunias, because I've built some new beds, the stone beds in particular. I'm going to load with pansies and petunias next year. I'll have some perennials in there. Dahlias are more difficult to grow for me, and so I'm not sure what I'll be putting in there, but I'll just same thing, just walking around and admiring what you've put into the, the garden. It is definitely something to think about. Rick says, my late mother planted a frangipani tree next to the master bedroom. Sight and smell. Oh, that's even better. I have my lilacs just around the corner from the window where I sit and watch TV. And I just wish the lilacs lasted for more than just a couple weeks of the year. Because, yes, having that sight and that smell of anything outside your window, fantastic, absolutely fantastic in any aspect of gardening. Many of us focus on our vegetable gardens. Branch out, grow some flowers next to your windows and give yourself something to look at and smell. Absolutely. That's one of those things I think can really add a new component to your gardening when you add for yourself that look and smell. Absolutely. Okay. Let's see. I think I'm almost caught up. I'm within a minute. I'm almost down to the end of the comments. Oh, wow. That was great. I think I got almost everything that you guys had asked. I may have passed over a few things. I apologize for that if I missed something. Concrete Jungle says, I love violas and lobelias. Yes, me too. Violas, I love my violas. And that's one of those that I just let reseed and fill the space as much as possible. I did have some violas in that tower. Their blooms do not last as long. But I did have a couple resprout. So fantastic flowers, absolutely fantastic flowers. And I think that's one of those things that, like I said, next year I may do some videos showing how you can grow those. The thing I did, and I don't remember if I mentioned it in a video or a live stream at the beginning of the season, but I took advantage of an early sale. So I was able to get all of those plants on sale at my big box store garden center, and was able to fill my green stock. So I think that is a 6-tier green stock. It might be a 7. I think it might be a 7-tier. So 42 cells, and I was able to get all of the plants to fill that for, I think it was $18 because everything was on sale. One of the best investments I've ever made was to buy all those 6-packs. It was like 6 plants in a container, and I think it was like 6 for $1.50. You just can't go wrong with that. And so I bought a bunch of them, and I filled that green stock tower, and it's flowered all season long. And I absolutely love it. So think about that kind of thing next year. If you're looking for new ideas of something maybe you haven't done before, take advantage of some of those sales early in the season and buy the plants that are going to flower all season long, like the plants I've been talking about. But also think about doing it now at the end of the season. So if you're in springtime, getting ready to start your garden, get out there and find a sale. If you're in the fall and ready to think about putting your garden to bed, go to your garden center and you'll probably find some clearance plants. Look straggly. You don't think they're going to survive. They might not. Chances are they will. And you can buy them at a bargain. Put them in the ground. If it's a perennial, it'll overwinter. It'll grow next year. You get blooms next year at a fraction of the cost. So lots of ways we can add plants to the garden and save money in the process. And anytime we can get that visual, it's wonderful. Roses you don't generally see on sale. So there are some of those fragrances that we like to have in our garden that you still have to buy. But there's a lot of other stuff out there that you can get for free, or maybe get seeds from someone like marigolds. Look for people around you that might have extra seeds that want to give them away, and it's an option for expanding your garden. And you can see like this with Andre's garden behind me. You can put flowers right in the middle of a tomato patch and still add that color and still add that extra little bit of beauty. We segregate our gardens so much, and I'm guilty of this. It makes for easy planning. It makes for easy maintenance to just have everything segregated. So all your tomatoes are in one area and all of your peppers in another area and all your potatoes in another area. And we segregate all of our different beds. But in many, many cases, we can intersperse the plants as long as they have the same water and nutrient and light requirements. You can grow them side by side. So think about doing that and having an amazing garden, especially if someone comes and just sees a jungle of plants of all different types. Such a wonderful aspect of gardening. So think about that. And yeah, Mobius is exactly right. No more monoculture. Get creative. And so mix it up a little bit. Try some things where it's a polyculture. It's a mix of different plants, and you really can have a lot of fun with that. I want to remind you that next week I'm not going to be here. October 14th, there is not a live stream. I will be back in 2 weeks, hopefully with Jay and Heidi at that point. I'll mention it on social media, so you may see it on Facebook and Instagram, and of course on my Gardener Scott community on YouTube. But if you didn't know that, I mentioned it last week, and so now you're just catching up and seeing it now. Just be aware where I'm not going to be here. So I'll miss you all, but I'll be back in 2 weeks, and we'll do this all over again. New topic as we move into another part of the growing season. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate all of your support and everything that you bring to me as I start my gardening week. And I hope your gardening week has started well and continues to move forward with very productive days. I'll see you in 2 weeks. And as you're out in your garden, just be sure to enjoy your gardening. I'll see you then.